We're going to finish up our review of freshwater habitats with wetlands. And a wetland is an area where the soil is wet, constantly wet for at least part of the year. So that might be have flowing water through it. It might be standing water. It might be fresh, salty, or brackish. Brackish refers to water that has some salt in it, but it's not as salty as ocean water. So it's somewhere between fresh and salty. And we're going to be identifying and differentiating between three different kinds of wetlands: bogs, marshes, and swamps. A bog is just a depression. So, for example, in the diagram here, we're seeing that there's a stream coming into the wetland and there's a stream going out of the wetland. A bog doesn't have those anything feeding into it, a stream feeding into it or feeding out. It's just a depression full of water, and there's a lot of special kind of moss that grows in a bog called sphagnum moss. And as it grows, it piles up on itself. It stacks up layer after layer after layer, and eventually buries itself. And that sphagnum moss that's buried turns into what we call peat. So it starts to decompose, and so it pretty much remains only partially decomposed, and it forms what we call peat. So in this diagram, even though this diagram is not showing a bog, it is showing peat. That is the result of sphagnum moss building up over a long period of time. And gardeners, for example, will use peat to add to their soil to make the soil retain more water. So peat's kind of like a sponge, and you can add it to soil to make it retain water better. A marsh is a shallow wetland along rivers, and it's underwater for all or part of the year, and contains cattails and other tall grass-like plants. So what we're looking at in this diagram is representing a marsh. It's along a river or a stream, and it's got cattails and grasses. Water flows slowly through swamps. So a swamp is basically a flooded forest. So the trees have adapted to be basically underwater a lot of the time. So a swamp is like an area where a river has spread way out and kind of flooded the forest. So again, this is a marsh, representing a marsh, and just a couple things I want to point out about what wetlands do. You know, this is showing us what wetlands do, and you can read that for yourself. But here's groundwater, so that's water underground, so it's percolating through soil and rock, and in the soil and rock there are bacteria that live there, and they help to biodegrade any contaminants that might be in the water. So water that's coming out of the ground, you can drink that. It purifies the water. And so what the bacteria are doing here is biodegradation of any contaminants that might be in the water. So that's an important water treatment that wetlands are performing here as the water flows into them underground and then flows out of them underground into a flowing body of water, or even a standing body of water, a pond or a lake. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that there may be nutrients, all kinds of nutrients from runoff and maybe municipalities dumping sewage into the stream or whatever, or river, and they'll come into the wetland and they'll be removed. Those are nutrients, right, that will fertilize algae and add to eutrophication. So one big service that wetlands do is clean the water, or remove nutrients from the water before it goes into bodies of water like streams and rivers and lakes. So it helps to keep eutrophication from happening. Whatever kind of wetland it is, they are very productive ecosystems. You know, there's plenty of water, there's plenty of light, and you know, if you give that to plants, they're going to take off. Plants and other photosynthetic organisms. They're also breeding grounds. They're also habitat. So a lot of things live there that really don't live anywhere else. So I want to relate what we're learning to Lake Erie, because Lake Erie is not far from us. And what we're looking at here is the western end of Lake Erie. This is the western basin, which is the shallowest part of the lake, and the part of the lake that's in the most trouble. in terms of eutrophication. This map came from a study that was done concerning the wetlands along the shore of the lake, along the eastern end here. And the outline here represents area that once was wetland. All of this was wetland at one time. Like go back a few hundred years, and this would have all been wetland. But it's all been diverted. You know, the water that feeds into the wetland and eventually would go into the lake has been diverted and drained and filled in and paved over. And so now those wetlands have been destroyed. And those wetlands did this for Lake Erie. They removed nutrients. As the water flowed through them, nutrients would be removed so that those nutrients wouldn't go into the lake and cause eutrophication. So if you look at the color coding here, you can see that what's not restorable is in white, and that's a large area within the study zone is white and therefore unrestorable wetlands. Red is highly restorable, and you can see there's very little red. So according to this study, it'd be difficult to return much of what has been developed back into wetland. So much of the wetlands that have been destroyed are not restorable. There's no way that we'll ever be able to bring them back. And it depends on being able to bring the water back. So if the way that they diverted the water, if there's no way to reverse that, and the fact that they filtered in and paved it over, I mean, you'd have to rip up the pavement and dig it back out again to restore it to be a wetland again. And, you know, the land's being used by people for various things, and they're probably not willing to give up that land so it could be restored to a wetland. So it's unfortunate, but that would help to solve the problem of eutrophication in Lake Erie. So along with freshwater wetlands, there are also saltwater wetlands. Estuary, that's what we call an estuary. And an estuary is a wetland that's formed where rivers meet the sea. So here's a river coming in, and here's the ocean out here. And so there's a mix of both fresh and salt water. And again, that's what we refer to as brackish. It's also greatly affected by the tides. So when the tide comes in, the river will actually flow backwards and be inundated with salt water. So when the tide comes in, salt water comes in, and when the tide goes out, then the river water comes back down, and that's fresh water. So the estuary has to, and organisms that live in the estuary have to deal with changing water conditions. And if you'll recall, the amount of salt in the water is going to make it either hypotonic or hypertonic. And so these organisms need to learn how to really osmoregulate the amount of water in their body, because sometimes they're surrounded by hypertonic water and sometimes hypotonic water. They're also highly productive, just like wetlands in general, because there's plenty of water and plenty of sunlight. So there are plants and algae and photosynthetic and even chemosynthetic organisms that are living in estuaries. And they also receive a lot of what we call detritus. Detritus is organic material. It's the remains, it's bits and pieces or parts of once living organisms. That's what we call detritus. And it's a food source. So there are organisms that will feed on that, filter feeders and scavengers, basically, that are going to be feeding on detritus, and those are known as detritivores. Just like freshwater wetlands, estuaries are important spawning grounds for a lot of different species, nurseries, and also habitat for a lot of different species. And as we can see from this diagram, they are also subject to eutrophication, just like freshwater lakes are. So we've got this river coming in, and notice there's a lot of human activity around this river, and this is the way it really looks along coastlines. There's a lot of the water treatment plant and runoff from a farm, and residential runoff from like fertilized yards and septic systems that are putting basically sewage into the river, and that's all feeding into the estuary, and it's all nutrients. So it's feeding nutrients into the estuary. And again, nutrients are not necessarily a good thing. Too many nutrients means there are algal blooms, so all the algae then lives and dies and sinks to the bottom, and decomposition takes place, and that removes oxygen from the water. You'll also notice that there's stratification here, just like we see in freshwater lakes. But in this case, the stratification isn't due to temperature differences, it's due to salinity differences. In other words, how much salt's dissolved in the water. So notice it's labeled denser salt water here and then freshwater. So freshwater floats on salt water. It's lighter than salt water. It's less dense than salt water. So the layers here are created by differences in the salt dissolved in the water. But that separates the layers enough that just like the hypolimnion in a lake, when the oxygen is removed from the water, there's no mixing from the surface to deliver oxygen down to the hypolimnion. This isn't called a hypolimnion. That's only in a freshwater lake. But what I'm saying is it's pretty much the same thing. It's similar to it. So we have eutrophication is a problem in estuaries, just like it is in freshwater habitats. So much so that you can end up with dead zones, and you can end up with dead zones that actually reach out into the ocean. So, for example, at the mouths of rivers, a lot of times there is a dead zone that fans out way out into the ocean. So we're going to take a look at two estuarian wetlands. One is salt marshes, and the other are mangrove swamps. And a salt marsh is in the temperate zone. So if we look at this map, for example, down here is the tropics and up here is temperate, right? Temperate is where seasons change. Down in the tropics, seasons don't change much. There's not much of a change. So salt marshes are found up here in temperate regions, and it's basically just an estuary that's in the temperate region. Mangrove swamps are tropical estuaries, so all of these down here would be that are marked on this map with various colors are going to be tropical estuaries or mangrove swamps. And mangroves are trees that grow that are specialized to grow in brackish water. So they're submerged, their roots are submerged all the time. The trees are basically growing out of the water, and they can handle that even though there's salt in that water. This map comes from a study done to identify estuaries, estuarian wetlands, and also identify whether or not they were eutrophic or recovering or hypoxic. So many, as you can see, many wetlands in the United States and down south of the United States in the Caribbean are suffering from eutrophication, but mostly suffering from hypoxia. And the hypoxia is related to eutrophication. You know, that's the oxygen that is being used up by decomposers. So we see the same thing happening in all these estuaries that we see in freshwater lakes and in that's happening in estuaries too. So according to this map, most estuaries are hypoxic because of eutrophication. Luckily, the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is working through the Estuary Restoration Act to reclaim habitat and restore water flow and reduce pollution. So the estuaries here that are recovering, the green ones, are recovering due to the efforts of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So good for them. We're going to end here with a crash course in oceanography or marine biology. And you know, all of this is already down here, and you can read that for yourself. I'll be referring to a lot of what's down here as we go through the diagram. So again, we're studying these aquatic habitats because that's where the protists live. We're studying the kingdom Protista, and this is where the protists live. So we'll start here looking at photoautotrophs, as we've done so many times. The photoautotrophs that are in aquatic habitats are phytoplankton, unicellular and colonial protists, plant-like protists, algae. There's also macroalgae. And so those are going to be living in the photic zone. So that's the first zone we want to identify here, the photic zone. So it's the part of the ocean that's close to the surface that light penetrates. That's the photic zone. And in this diagram, here's the phytoplankton. again, one-celled and colonial plant-like protists or algae. And then here we've got a multicellular algae called oarweed, and that's actually in the phylum Phaeophyta. It's a brown algae. It's a kelp. There's also some very special kind of unicellular algae that lives inside the tissues of coral. It's called Zooxanthellae. So coral has this Zooxanthellae as a endosymbiont. It's a mutualistic endosymbiotic relationship where the algae is living inside the tissues of the coral, and it's photosynthetic, like all algae is, and so it's making food. But it's not only making food for itself, it's making food for the coral. And of course, photosynthesis requires light, so that explains why corals can only live in the Aphotic Zone. You'll only find them along the continental shelves where light penetrates. You may have heard of coral bleaching. That's when the water gets too warm for the coral. Coral is adapted to a specific range of temperature, and when it gets too warm, the coral doesn't like it, and it spits out its Zooxanthellae, and that causes the coral to change color. And usually it becomes a lighter color or even white, and that's why they call it coral bleaching. But that's what happened. That's the result of climate change. So climate change is warming the water, and when the water gets too warm, the coral spit out their Zooxanthellae, and that's bleaching. And they can recover from that, but if the water stays warm too long, the coral dies. So that's a big problem for our coral reefs. The other problem for coral, and it's related to climate change, because climate change is being caused by the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's also producing ocean acidification. And that's because the carbon dioxide is dissolving in the water and becoming carbonic acid and decreasing the pH of the water. And that makes it difficult for coral to build the calcium carbonate houses around itself. Coral's made up of thousands of little tiny anemones that are living together in a colony, and each little anemone builds a little calcium carbonate house around itself. Well, in acidic conditions, it's difficult for the coral to build that calcium carbonate to secrete and the calcium carbonate and build their houses. So ocean acidification is hitting coral reefs hard too, unfortunately. So the bottom line here is that the algae are the producers in all aquatic food webs, whether they be freshwater or marine food webs. We also are looking at the aphotic zone here. So here's the aphotic zone. That's most of the volume of the ocean is aphotic. It's only down to 200 meters near the surface that light penetrates. Below that, it gets dimmer and dimmer until there's no light at all down at the bottom. And so the only producers that can survive down there with no light would be the chemoautotrophs, if you'll recall. Chemoautotrophic prokaryotes. And if you'll recall, they live down around hydrothermal vents because they need to carry out not photosynthesis but chemosynthesis. And they're using the energy from chemicals that are coming out of the hydrothermal vents to get the energy they need to make their own food. So it's just like photosynthesis, it's just that the energy for the process comes from chemical energy instead of light energy. So marine biologists and oceanographers use light, how far light penetrates, to determine these zones, but they also use the depth and topography of the ocean floor in order to determine zones. So that's how we end up with these areas known as the Continental Shelf, which fringes all the continents, and it can reach out as far as 200 miles from the continents. So that's all in the Aphotic Zone. So there's a lot of productivity going on those continental shelves, and that's again where we find coral reefs and such. And then from the continental shelves, as we go down, there's the continental slope, and then as we get to the bottom here, it levels out to the abyssal plain. Oceanographers use the influence of tides to designate the intertidal zone. Inter means in between, so the intertidal zone is between high tide and low tide. This is the area that is sometimes underwater when the tide is in, and sometimes not underwater when the tide is out. And that's a pretty harsh environment for any kind of organisms to live in. Sometimes they're under salt water, and sometimes they're not. So they have to adapt to that if they're going to live in the intertidal. So it's the influence of tides that designates the intertidal zone and separates it from what's referred to as the pelagic realm. And that's everything from low tide, the low tide line, all the way out into the open ocean. That's the pelagic realm. So it's most of the ocean is pelagic. And the organisms that live there are pelagic organisms. So whether they're swimming or floating, they're pelagic. So as long as you're off the bottom, all the water in the pelagic realm is considered pelagic. And that's to differentiate it from the very bottom. So the substrate, the bottom of the ocean, is referred to as the Benthic Realm. And there are organisms that live on the Benthic Realm. They either attach themselves or they crawl along. And so they're basically always on the bottom. And those are referred to as the benthos. But a lot of them are filter feeders. They're attached filter feeders, or they're crawling around and eating detritus, so they're detritivores down here. So that's what pretty much determines the oceanic zones and realms and habitats.